friends, to Beyond the Crucible, the podcast that dares to talk about setback and failure, but it's not so we can commiserate. It's so we can elevate. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our mission today is to offer you the hope that your crucible experiences, those tragedies and setbacks that you faced or are facing right now, don't define you. They refine you. They did not happen to you. They happened for you. And I don't know many people, probably no person, who knows that better than the founder of Beyond the Crucible, the host of this show, and my friend Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, we are back again with a summer series, and I know you're excited about what we're going to be talking about here. I'm excited about it too. This is going to be several weeks of really interesting, insightful, and I hope inspirational content, right?
Absolutely. Very much looking forward to it. And this particular episode is going to be a very interesting one.
Yes. Good, like tease there, or a good trailer, if you will. And it's appropriate to talk about trailers because we are going sort of back to the future in the sense that 2 years ago, we did a summer series looking at the lessons that we could learn to bounce back from crucibles from movie heroes. And of those movie heroes, we had superheroes, sports heroes, action heroes, and historical heroes. That was our summer series of 2 years ago. This time around, because we had such a good time with that series, we thought we'd do it again with a twist. And the twist that we're doing it with, and I know this was exciting to you, is that we're going to go through some of the American Film Institute's top 100 films. AFI every year does their top 100 films in the history of the United States. And we're going to go through 9 of those films in this series. And we're going to start with the number 1 film on the list, on their most recent list. And that is, drum roll, please, or finger taps, please. That film is Citizen Kane, which is not just by AFI, but many accounts, the number 1 film in that has ever been produced in America, by Orson Welles, who I have to take this time to say this, Warwick. Orson Welles wrote it, directed it, stars in it. He also is from Kenosha, Wisconsin, where I am from. So I'm very excited about that.
Really?
Yes.
Boy, that is really impressive. And he was such an interesting guy that I read somewhere he got complete and full control. He could edit. He could do whatever he wanted. Yep. And the studio never gave people that. So this is all Orson Welles' creation.
Right. And he was an auteur. He was young. He was in his 20s when he made it. And that's the kind of, when that kind of talent rolls into Hollywood, they give him everything he wants. And interestingly, before we get into the film and what it can teach us about crucibles, it was his first film, and it was the apex of his film career. He never reached that height again in what he did. But let's start out this conversation by asking you, because I know how much you love films. Why are films such a ripe wellspring to pull lessons about bouncing forward from crucibles? Why is that something that we discovered it in our first series? We discovered it as we've talked about preparing for this episode. Why is that so ripe for helping people navigate their way back from a crucible?
Yeah, Gary, classic films and movies, there's often a protagonist up against incredible odds. You might have ordinary people becoming heroic figures, or heroic figures in history, or superheroes. It's often a test of character. Yes, there may be a lot of action depending on what the movie is, but even beneath the action or the drama, there will be just immense challenge to somebody's character. How will they respond? Will they rise above it? Will they sink into bitterness and anger? Will they be too afraid to do anything? So that's why movies are often really interesting things to study, especially in the nature of Beyond the Crucible. Because, we always talk about we want folks not to be defined by their worst day. and find a way to bounce back, rise above what they've been through. And so movies are often a great way of looking at those issues because, typically movies aren't about small issues. They're often about immense trials, immense challenges. And so it's a great place to learn from. And that's really what we're trying to do over this summer series is learn from these great movies and the immense challenges the characters had.
Yeah. And it's interesting, as you were saying that both movies and the importance of character in how you navigate your way beyond a crucible is a very integral part of your book, Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance. So this isn't your first rodeo, as they say, when it comes to talking about character in movies and how it helps you move beyond crucibles, right?
Absolutely. And that's a good point. I mean, I've always been fascinated by history, men and women who've achieved great things, went up against incredible odds, whether it's, Winston Churchill in Britain in World War II or Franklin Roosevelt in the Depression and the Second World War, or Abraham Lincoln, president during the U.S. Civil War. Leaders that were confronted with huge challenges, and how did they respond? So it's just something that's always fascinated me. Hence there's quite a few stories in the book and, lessons we can learn from people in just extraordinary times and how they responded. So I've always been fascinated by people who had to respond to incredibly tough conditions, tough situations.
Right. And as we talk about Citizen Kane, we're going to run into some things. We've done 210 episodes of this, more than 210 episodes of this podcast. And this is the first time we're going to talk about some of the things that we talk about in this episode. So stay tuned, folks, because this is an episode unlike any other that you've heard or seen us do before. So hang tight. So let's start talking about Citizen Kane. The opening scene of the movie sets the tone for the way the movie is done. It's not a linear movie where here's the origin story and then we march through. No, the opening, it starts with the end in mind, if you will. It starts at the end of the movie. The opening scene shows the death of the title character, Charles Foster Kane. There's a close-up of his face. He drops a snow globe he's holding, and he breathes his last after uttering a single word, sort of as a whisper. He says, Rosebud. The very next scene explains who we saw pass away, who Charles Foster Kane was. The story of his life is told via a newsreel and introduces into evidence several key points of the life he lived. And I'm just going to run through some of these, Warwick, because it's excellent filmmaking, aside from the points that we're going to talk about, and just how to quickly know who Charles Foster Kane is. It's his origin story, if you will, but not from the origin. It tells his whole through line of his story. And here's some things that this newsreel makes known about Charles Foster Kane. He lived in a huge pleasure palace, the newsreel calls it, that he built, called Xanadu. The mountain on which he built his home was built itself with 10,000 trees and 20,000 tons of marble. It was on 49,000 acres on the Gulf Coast of Florida. He is described in the newsreel as a collector of everything, so big it cannot be cataloged or appraised, enough for 10 museums, the loot of the world. And the beautiful part about that is the voice who does, if you've ever seen a newsreel, that very serious intonation, the loot of the world. I mean, that's how they say it. It's done very dramatically, but that gives you this idea very early on of just who this guy was. The narrator also says this, since the pyramids, Xanadu, Kane's house, is the costliest monument a man has ever built to himself. That sets the stage pretty well, right? How Charles Foster Kane lived. But we learn in the very next scene, that's not all the newsreel chief of the newsreel wanted. The head of the newsreel studio orders his staff to redo it after he watches it, because he says it's not enough to tell what a man did. You have to tell who he was. He assigns a reporter, Jerry Thompson, to do that by interviewing those close to the man to find out what Rosebud is all about. What do his last words mean? That's Jerry Thompson's mission throughout the film, and that's what we see unfurl. So I'm going to set it up this way, Warwick, before I ask you a question about it. I mean, it introduces a key theme of the film. Charles Foster Kane spent his money trying to bring himself notice and happiness. There's a pivotal scene in the newsreel that shows newspaper headlines about his passing. The one from the first newspaper he owned, the New York Daily Inquirer, reads this way, Warwick. It says, Charles Foster Kane dies after lifetime of service. The use of the word service is key here, I think, right? We will discover little by little as the story is told in flashback that Kane never served in the beyond the crucible sense, as in living his life on purpose dedicated to serving others. He lived life, we will discover, dedicated to serving himself. And here's the last point before I ask you this question. In that sense, Charles Foster Kane, Citizen Kane, is a cautionary tale. This film is a cautionary tale about what can happen when we never find the life of significance that will bring us joy and fulfillment. Charles Foster Kane had a lot of money, but no joy. So this is a really unique path for us to take on this show, isn't it, Warwick? We've not yet talked to a person or talked about a person, real or fictional, who can teach us valuable lessons about moving beyond our crucible because they never moved beyond theirs. This is the first time we've done it, right?
It's such a great point, Gary. With all of the guests we've had on the podcast, we've said this person is an example of somebody that wasn't defined by their worst day. They found a way to overcome their crucible, whether it was physical crucible, whether it was something terrible that was done to them, whether it was a terrible mistake. They found a way to forgive themselves, found a way to give others, found a way to find a vision to help others, a life of significance amidst the ashes of the crucible that they went through. In a sense, Charles Foster Kane is the complete opposite of that paradigm. He is, in one sense, an anti-hero. He is somebody that was indeed defined by their worst day, which we will talk about in a moment. And he was damaged by that worst day. And rather than growing from it, he became more bitter, more ego-driven. And rather than learning the lessons of them, he went the other direction. He was more and more defined by the original crucible and future crucibles. He became bitter, angrier, lonelier. I mean, just that opening scene of the movie when it starts off with this sort of metal fence. It's dark. Everything is gloomy. Charles Foster Kane is dying. He's alone. Just that opening few seconds almost tells you everything you need to know. This is not a story with a happy ending. It's quite the reverse. So I think this is a fascinating movie, but it's not because we can learn so much from what Charles Foster Kane did and how he lived his life. We can learn a lot from the mistakes that he made and just becoming increasingly selfish. It's a sad and very sobering tale. And it's easy for us to say, oh, well, hey, I'm not Charles Foster Kane.
Right.
I don't have a big mansion like Xanadu. I'm not a media magnate. I don't have enough money to hurt people. I mean, at least not on an epic, a nationwide scale. So yeah, okay. It's kind of interesting, but hey, that's not me. Well, I'm reminded of the phrase, there but for the grace of God go I. Given the right set of circumstances, that could be us. It depends. A crucible could come that maybe we haven't faced yet. And maybe we will be defined by that. Maybe we'll choose to be bitter. We won't forgive. We'll be angry at ourselves and others. And bitterness tends to grow like weeds. And the more bitter and angry we get more egocentric. And then we hurt people, often those we love, because they're the closest to us. So it's easy to look at this and almost chuckle saying, well, this is interesting. This could never be me. Well, maybe not in terms of the millions or billions that Charles Foster Kane had, but in terms of the choices he made in life. Life is about choices. And this is a very harrowing and sad tale, sobering tale about the choices that one man made and where it leads to.
Yeah. And I think about it as you were talking about in the context of Beyond the Crucible. First thing I think about is Charles Foster Kane. If he were a real person, we would not have as a guest on Beyond the Crucible, right? I mean, he's not moved beyond his crucible. He never got to living a life of significance as we define it. The other thing that I thought of just now as you were talking about what we try to do here at Beyond the Crucible is, a slogan could be, Beyond the Crucible, preventing people from becoming Charles Foster Kanes, right? I mean, that's one of the things, right? The things that we talk about on this show, the things that you talk about in your blogs, that you talk about when you speak, that you talk about in your book, is designed to help people not get stuck in that bad place that Charles Foster Kane could never get off of. And I hadn't thought about it in that perspective. We are, in many ways, very, very, very realistically, trying to be the antidote to Charles Foster Kane-ness in the lives of people.
Money and power, as we all know, whether you look at politics or folks in the business world, it can be intoxicating. It is hard to resist. It's funny, I just think of that phrase from the Bible, which says, it's harder for a rich man to, enter the kingdom of heaven than a camel to go through the eye of a needle. And basically what that means more broadly is people who grow up or achieve wealth and power, it's very hard for them to think of others and think of some higher purpose, because money and power tend to be intoxicating and a bit like a drug, and it tends to make you think just of yourself. So anybody's capable of redemption, but boy, with money and power, that can be a tough, road to, change.
Right. And because of Beyond the Crucible, we help folks identify where their crucibles might be and help them process them. Let's talk about what Charles Foster Kane's crucible was. Kane's crucible is being removed as a young boy in the late 1870s from his mother and father, who own a boarding house in Colorado. Gold was discovered through a mining deed belonging to Kane's mother, Mary Kane. She hired banker Walter Thatcher to establish a trust that would provide for Kane's education and assume guardianship of him. While the parents and Thatcher discussed arrangements inside the boarding house, we can see Wells films the young Kane playing happily with a sled in the snow outside. When Kane's parents introduced him to Thatcher, the boy struck Thatcher with the sled and attempted to run away. And I thought this was a very telling point that'll come to play later in the movie. His mother says she'd already packed his trunk a week earlier with all the things he will take from the home. I thought that was really interesting, that she determined what he needed, what she thought he needed, but ignoring the truth that what he needed was her. What he needed was love. She gave him material things, right? And what we see through his whole life, we saw it in the opening newsreel footage. He collects material things, but we'll discover that the thing that his mother denied him by sending him away is the same thing that he ends up being denied throughout his life through his own actions. So what that leaves us with is this: being torn away from his parents is the crucible that leads to Kane's self-serving and unhappy life. The film never shows him reflecting on it, just suffering from it and hurting others because of it. How do you see all of that playing out in the film, Warwick, what I just described?
Gary, it's such a devastatingly sad scene. Here he is as a young boy. I don't know, it looks like maybe 7 or 8, somewhere around there. And he's playing in the snow in, somewhere in the wilds of Colorado. His parents have this sort of dilapidated boarding house, and his mother just sort of makes this decision that somehow she's has some money from a deed that she had to a mine, and she's going to put it in trust for her son. And Walter Thatcher is going to be the guardian and manage Charles Foster Kane's affairs while he grows up. She just makes this decision that having, money and privilege and, growing up back east, rather than in this sort of ramshackle boarding house, that he'll have a better life that way. And she also hints at sort of other challenges that he had growing up when his father tries to push back a bit. And Mary Kane says, basically, by sending him away, I'll get him away from you. So that hints that maybe Kane's father abused him. So she felt like she was doing the best thing she could for his life financially, but also providing him a safer place. It's just so, it's so devastatingly sad. She might have thought she was doing the right thing, but from what we can see, there was no record of Charles Foster Kane having any more contact with his mother. The film doesn't talk about it. He doesn't talk about it. But there's no question that, a young Charles must have felt abandoned by his mother. There's a time when he, picks up that sled, I think as you mentioned, and throws the sled at this, Walter Thatcher.
Right.
Clearly he's angry. He says, well, Mom, when am I going to see you? And it's like, well, I'll be along later. I mean, she's basically lying to him because she just, what do you say to a young child that way? This crucible of abandonment must have been searing, but it would only get worse. That sense of abandonment would just grow and get worse. And then on top of that sense of being abandoned by, his mother, he had the crucible of wealth.
Right.
Walter Thatcher, unfortunately, I say almost sarcastically, was very good at his job. So he inherited a mine, but Walter Thatcher made that mine grow into such considerable wealth that, as we'll see when Kane came of age, he was incredibly wealthy. So he suffered the crucible of abandonment, but then he's going to suffer the crucible of growing up, at least from aged 8 on, with immense wealth and privilege, but without love. He didn't have the love of his parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, nobody, no family. He had a guardian that's focused on managing his affairs well, but he doesn't have any love. So he has crucibles of abandonment and wealth and privilege, but no love. That's a toxic mix that is going to warp many a person's character. And it does. Those crucibles, they define who Charles Foster Kane becomes. It's really sad. It's a terrible mix of crucibles that will, in a sense, destroy him as a human being. For all intents and purposes. It's really, really sad.
We'll pick up his story now because he inherits all of that money that Walter Thatcher got for him when he turns 25. He's already one of the richest people on the planet at that point. And he's also already sort of an aimless raconteur. He's proud of being kicked out of several colleges when he decides the only asset he wants to take control of among his holdings is a newspaper, the Daily Inquirer. He talks after taking it over of looking after the interests of the underprivileged, of using the paper to help the little guy. He doesn't care that the paper is losing $1 million a year. He ends up owning, as we hear in the newsreel, 37 papers in all. And he writes a declaration of principles in which he speaks highly of his commitment to tell all the news honestly, to tell the truth quickly and simply and entertainingly. His best friend, Jedediah Leland, asks to be given the handwritten editorial on which he wrote the declaration. Later, in a reflective moment after the Depression wipes him out of cash, he remains in charge of the newspapers. As he's talking to Thatcher about his financial situation, he says, "If I hadn't been rich, I might have been a great man." Interesting part of that for me is Kane has the knowledge of his true character, but not the strength to grow beyond it. As Jedediah Leland suspected when he asked for the Declaration of Principles, Kane can write movingly of what's right about serving others, but can't bring himself to truly act on it. The true tragedy of his story is he never learns the lessons of his crucible. Is that, Warwick, a fair assessment of the character of Charles Foster Kane?
I'm afraid it is. I mean, it's just so sad. That moment that you talk about when Jedediah Leland says, can I have the Declaration of Principles? Leland at the time senses that he doesn't know what's going to happen to his friend. There's a sense of foreboding. I think there and at other times in the movie when they talk about bringing in new staff into the Daily Enquirer, Leland even says, well, we'll see if they change us, if they change the Enquirer, or, if we change them. There was this sense of, I don't think Kane understands it at the time, but Leland is wondering, I wonder if we'll all be like this, if Charles Foster Kane is always going to be like this. So that's why he took it. Right. This movie is a tragic story of somebody that allows himself to be destroyed by crucibles of abandonment, wealth, ego. What makes this movie so good is true villains, if you will. And I don't know if Charles Foster Kane is a villain, but is a type of villain, I suppose. Is there's something tragic, something pitiable in them. The great villains are ones that there's part of them you can almost slightly empathize with, even if you don't want to. And so in that sense, it's a carefully crafted character. So he, senses that he could have been a great person without wealth. And certainly in his younger days, in that Declaration of Principles, he talks about fighting for the common man and woman, fighting for the underdog against the elites. And part of him, I think, means it. Part of it thinks that'll be great for circulation and let's shake things up and that'll be fun. But it's not all cynicism. There's part of it that actually wants to do that wants to live out these principles, to help the underdog, help the struggling working men and women. But the sad thing is, over time, almost like a Star Wars movie, the dark side squashes out all the other elements of his character. And so he becomes increasingly self-centered, egotistical. It increasingly becomes about him. He's somebody that is unable to find a way out of his flaws. It's such a depressing portrait that we have of Charles Foster Kane. When we think of the beginning of the movie, or as we'll see at the end of the movie, where he is in this palatial castle of Xanadu on the Florida Gulf Coast. It's dark. He's alone. It truly is a gilded prison. He's built a monument to his own self-centeredness, his own ego. And that's a physical manifestation of that prison. He's imprisoned at Xanadu. He is just imprisoned by his ego and selfishness, as we'll see, that not only destroys him, but destroys those around him. So it's just a very sad story. And what makes it sadder is some of the original crucibles weren't his fault, the wealth, ego, abandonment, but he chooses not to learn from them. He chooses not to rise above them, and he becomes overwhelmed and destroyed by them. And even his altruistic tendencies of wanting to help people, that gets overwhelmed by his own ego and self-centeredness. So it's, rather than growing as a human being, he does the reverse. He, just gets destroys himself. And rather than learn the lessons, he does the opposite. He just gets more self-centered, more egotistical, and less focused on helping others. It's the exact opposite of what we talk about at Beyond the Crucible.
Right. And it struck me when I watched this again, and I've seen the movie a number of times. It struck me when I watched it again, there's really no one in this film to root for. Even the friends around him sort of get sucked into what's going on. They have fealty toward him. They don't really stand strong. Jedediah Leland may be one who's I see Jedediah Leland as somebody who, if he had a little more character himself, if he acted on that a little more, he'd make a perfect fellow traveler for Charles Foster Kane. But that never was able to come together either, which was, part of the Jedediah Leland could see where his friend went wrong, but he couldn't help get him over the edge, right? I mean, you noted some things that that Jedediah Leland found, said about Kane when he was being interviewed by the reporter who was redoing the newsreel, right? I mean, just, kind of run through some of those things, because he gets who his buddy is. He just can't help get him the other, past that.
It's so well said. I mean, as you say, if Jedediah Leland had had a bit more spine, maybe he could have helped him. But on the other hand, Charles Foster Kane probably wouldn't have been open to help. But if Kane had been more open to being helped and Leland had had a bit more courage, perhaps, then, because obviously Leland's getting paid well and, why would you want to leave that gig, if you will? So I think, but it's true, Leland in another world, another universe, definitely could have helped Kane. But some of the things that Leland observed about Kane is just, it's telling, it's true, and it's devastatingly sad. Leland said, Kane wasn't a brutal man. He just did brutal things. He said Kane loved himself, but didn't have love to give. Kane talks about people like he owns them. Kane doesn't love anyone but himself. He wants people to love him, but on his terms, according to his rules.
Right.
If Kane had something that really drove him, other than wealth and ego, he had an insatiable and unrequited need for people to love him. And you don't have to be a psychologist or psychiatrist to figure that out. He was abandoned by his mother from his perspective at age, 7 or 8. And he just has this need to surround himself with people who will love him, but he's not able to receive that love. And he almost wants to buy their love in some sense. If I give you things, maybe you'll love me. If I write nice things about the underdog, working man and woman, maybe they'll love me. He just has this craving to be loved, but not able to receive it and not able to give it to others. He feels like the only way I can be loved is if I buy it, if I force people to love me. It's such a sad mix of emotions that he has.
Right. And unfortunately, this continues to happen, right? Here are some more beats of Charles Foster Kane's life. The audience also continues to see the compromises of his character that he makes to try to capture the love denied him as a boy. He gets married to a president's niece, which quickly grows loveless, that marriage. He uses his journalistic influence not to report the news as much to influence it, fanning the flames of conflict so much his papers are identified as a key reason for the Spanish-American War. He has an affair with a would-be singer that causes him both his marriage and his bid to be New York's governor. Jedediah Leland sums up the measure of the man. He never believed in anything but Charlie Kane. Warwick, how does all of that I've just talked about further underscore the tragedies of his life, of where Charles Foster Kane continues to find himself as he grows older?
So earlier we see Charles Foster Kane being abandoned as a young boy, growing up amidst immense wealth and privilege that tends to erode his character. But here we see examples of where that innate selfishness and self-centeredness begins to hurt other people. He progressively alienates his first wife, Emily, who, as you've mentioned, was the niece of a president. His selfishness gradually erodes that marriage and the love that she has for him. And then, one of the defining crucibles of his adult life is when he runs for governor of New York And he doesn't do this in a principled way. It's all about ego. He says, I'm standing up for the working man and woman. And he wants to overthrow the New York political machine headed up by Jim Geddes. Now, it's one thing to say, yeah, this guy's corrupt and or I'm opposing him. But he says, when I'm governor of New York, I'm going to do everything I can to throw Jim Geddes in prison. I'll indict him. He'll be in prison. Like, this is scorched earth campaigning. And you do that at your peril, because Jim Geddes, let's just assume that he's part of that New York political machine. He was probably going to throw everything at Kane that he could, but this gives him every extra incentive, because this Kane is such a wacko that if he becomes governor, he might indeed find a way to throw me in prison. Right. This guy doesn't have any scruples. Maybe he has even less scruples than I do, thinks Jim Geddes. And so he finds some quote unquote dirt on Kane and finds that Kane is having an affair with Susan Alexander, and he confronts Kane. He brings along Kane's wife, Emily, just to make things more difficult for Kane. And he says, look, Kane, you don't deserve it, but I'll give you an out. You resign from the race as governor, and I'm not going to, rake you through the mud. You don't deserve this, but I'm going to offer you that. Well, Kane doesn't withdraw. And in a very telling phrase, Geddes says to Kane, you're not going to learn your lesson, are you? I guess you're going to have to get some more lessons. He says it in a sort of a rueful, semi-stoic way, as if just the way life is.
That's a powerful scene. Let's take a look at it.
If you don't listen to reason, it may be too late.
Too late? For what? For you and this public thief to take the love of the people of this state away from me?
Charlie, you got other things to think about. Your little boy. You don't want him to read about you in the papers.
There's only one person in the world to decide what I'm going to do, and that's me.
You decided what you were going to do, Charles, some time ago.
You're making a bigger fool of yourself than I thought you would, Mr. Kane.
I've got nothing to talk to you about.
You licked. Why don't you...
Get out. If you want to see me, have the warden write me a letter.
If anybody else I'd say what's going to happen to you, it would be a lesson to you. Only you're going to need more than one lesson. You're going to get more than one lesson.
Don't worry about me, Geddes. Don't worry about me! I'm Charles Foster Kane!
So, Warwick, how did that all turn out for Charles Foster Kane?
It all comes out, the dirt on Kane and the affair, and Kane ends up losing the race for governor. His political career is finished. It was a massive crucible because, I'm sure he craved respect while he has money and power, but that's gone now. It's just a complete humiliation, and it breaks up his marriage with his first wife, Emily.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that you just made, and I hadn't thought about it until you said it, but the idea that, right, he loses the campaign, which all indications were he was on track to perhaps win it because he's popular. But that was a crucible. Another crucible had happened. And one of the things that we talk about here, and that we have, folks, you have to remember is if you don't deal with your crucibles, they almost assuredly will contribute to other crucibles happening to you. If you continue to sort of stumble forward, in a way that is not informed by what you've learned from your crucibles, those are going to be tripping points in the future. And Charles Foster Kane, fictional character, even he discovers that because he never learned the lesson of his crucible, he continued to do things that brought him more crucibles. That's fair, right?
Absolutely. It's so true, Gary. It's interesting to contrast the treatment of his second wife, Susan Alexander, who was the woman he had an affair with his first wife, Emily. it seemed like while the marriage went from, somewhat caring to loveless with Emily, the way he treated Susan, his second wife, seems to be a lot worse than Emily. And so what happens is Susan is somebody that wants to be a singer, but her voice isn't really objectively that good. But yet, in some manic way, Charles Foster Kane wants his wife to be an opera singer. He even builds an opera house in Chicago, the Chicago Opera House. And she begins to realize, I can't sing. I mean, he hires a singing coach who basically, in a frustrated way, says, I can't do anything with her.
Right.
I mean, she just can't sing. Charles Foster Kane's pain and crucibles, pain leaks out. And so he treats her, it would seem, worse than his first wife, Emily. And just really, it's an abusive relationship, frankly. It's so sad. And, it's awful what he does to her. So yes, his character gets worse. His treatment of others gets worse. And the toxic mix that in his character, it grows and flourishes in the worst sense of that word.
Now, Citizen Kane is it's less than 2 hours of a movie. It's 119 minutes of a film. But we're going to do something here in this episode of the series that they used to do back in the day for really long movies. We're going to take a little bit of somewhat of an intermission from Kane's story. We'll come back to getting you through what Rosebud is. Hang on, we'll get there. But there's an interesting point here, Warwick, that I want you to unpack. And, some people see this movie and they can think, boy, that Orson Welles has a vivid imagination. He crafted a guy who's really, under it, who's really unable to move on after he's denied love, and his character continues to degrade. But Les, do you think that Charles Foster Kane is completely a figment of Orson Welles's creative imagination? He is largely based on a prominent newspaper tycoon whose real life story, Warwick, mostly or mirrors the most what we see in Kane's cinematic story.
Charles Foster Kane's life, or I should say, Charles Foster Kane's story, closely mirrors the life of William Randolph Hearst, who many have said was America's first media tycoon. Now, Orson Welles denied this in the sense of, yes, there were a number of people, Joseph Pulitzer, another media tycoon, and some others around, and it probably is an amalgam of several people. But when you look at the beats of each of these people's lives, Charles Foster Kane and William Randolph Hearst, there's a lot of commonalities. And maybe it's not based on just on Hearst, but a fair amount was. So let's look at some of those beats. So Hearst grew up out west, the son of a mining tycoon. As we learn, Kane's money came from gold mining. Hearst was thrown out of Harvard. He did some foolish things, acted up with professors and, whatever else. Kane was also thrown out of Ivy League colleges. Kane's first newspaper that he inherited from his father was the San Francisco Examiner. So we had, mining wealth, but he also had this newspaper. And so Hearst said, you know what? I really want to focus on newspapers, not mining. I want to focus on the San Francisco Examiner. So Kane did the same thing. He obviously had wealth from mining, but he wanted to focus on the New York Daily Enquirer. And interestingly enough, Hearst also hired away the best writers that he could find for the San Francisco Examiner. Kane did the same thing. Now, in this particular case, I think Hearst has Kane beat. When I was looking at Hearst's life, Hearst hired to write for the Examiner Mark Twain, who wrote The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He also hired Jack London, who wrote The Call of the Wild. So can you imagine, Gary, being in a newspaper room when your fellow journalists are like Mark Twain and Jack London?
Yeah.
And hey, why don't you guys write like this, like these two?
Yeah.
What it'd be like saying, how come you guys don't quarterback like, Tom Brady?
Yeah.
It's like, really? I think I write well, but You're talking about the greatest writers, in American history. I mean, come on. Yeah. So in that sense, you got to give it to Hearst. I think Hearst wins Kane that beat battle by a long way.
Hearst wins that battle for sure.
So anyway, and Hearst's papers had a sensationalist style like Kane's. Hearst believed he was a champion of working class Americans against the elite, but he was pretty ego-driven. Hearst also lost the governor's race for New York. Early, he ran for New York City mayor, but lost that one because of Tammany Hall, which was the New York political machine. And Hearst built a palatial estate in Southern California in the 1920s called San Simeon. I think it's amazing and grand. I think Xanadu might be even bigger. I don't know. And then here's one way of showing how closely these two stories mirror each other. When this movie came out in 1941, Hearst was still alive. He was mad. He was angry. He said to all these newspapers, do not print anything about Citizen Kane. I don't want any review, positive, negative. Just don't mention anything. That tells you Hearst thought there was some similarities. So I think as we step back a bit, yes, there's a lot we can learn from the life of Charles Foster Kane. It's tragic, but we shouldn't just think, oh, it's pure myth. Now, Hearst, and Kane are not identical, but was Hearst ego-driven? Sure. So I think, Citizen Kane, may be a fictional movie, but it is possible to have echoes of that in the real world and media tycoons back then, or maybe even media tycoons of a more modern era. It's easy to be swallowed up by wealth and power.
And this is a great time because we're still in kind of what we're calling our intermission before we go on with Charles Foster Kane's story. This is a good time to address the ink-stained elephant in the room. And the first part of that, I'm going to take one of the ears of the ink-stained elephant in the room. And in case you're watching this on YouTube and you're thinking, what in the heck kind of shirt is Gary wearing? Just take a look. It's all newspaper print right there, folks. If you're on YouTube, you can see that. And the idea is I'm a former newspaper editor myself. So we've got all this journalism blood flowing through this conversation, Warwick. And one of the things I want to make sure people understand, because they know your family background, is there's no chance that a film ever would have been made called Citizen Fairfax, because, right? I mean, you've got your family's media company, but explain a little bit about, we've talked about how that can be done wrong, both in William Randolph Hearst, for real, in life. Charles Foster Kane, we've been talking about and we'll continue to talk about in the films. But in real life, John Fairfax, your great-great-grandfather, founded a media dynasty that rivaled Hearst, rivaled Kane, but it was much, much different in terms of his character, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's a great point, Gary. So, yeah, my family's 150-year-old media company, John Fairfax Limited, was founded by my great-great-grandfather, John Fairfax, in 1841. And he was somebody that did learn the lessons of his crucible. Mm-hmm. He owned a small paper in the county of Warwickshire in England. He wrote an article about a lawyer that he thought was corrupt. The lawyer sued him. The judge ruled in John Fairfax's favor, but back then you had to pay your own court costs. And even though the judge ruled in John Fairfax's favor, he was bankrupted. Now, that didn't make him bitter. That didn't make him, I'm sure it made him sad, maybe somewhat angry at the time. But he said, well, I'm going to go somewhere else. I'm going to go to Australia, a new country where there's more opportunity. And he rose above that. It may have been a crucible losing this newspaper in England, but that crucible didn't define him. He was able to learn the lessons, moved to Australia, a land of more opportunity. He was able to found a great newspaper company. And it's interesting, when you compare Charles Foster Kane and John Fairfax, they couldn't be more different in their character and the choices they made and how they dealt with crucibles. So when you look at the original masthead of the Sydney Morning Herald, which was the original newspaper in the company, it said, "May Whigs call me Tory and Tory call me Whig," which basically in modern language means, may liberals call me conservative, may conservatives call me liberal. His idea was always to have a nonpartisan, independent newspaper. And that's what he strove to do, something that would uphold the young emerging colony and eventually nation of Australia. He was somebody that was a man of great faith. He was an elder in his church. He was a wonderful husband, a great father. His employees loved him. When John Fairfax died in the 1870s, his employees said, "We have lost a kind and valued friend." There were no worker rights laws back then. I mean, who says that about their employer? John Fairfax spent his whole life in service to others and the nation of Australia. It was never about ego. As I've read books about him and research, it's hard to think of a nonprofit that was started in Australia, especially Sydney, that he was part of. I mean, I understand he had this newspaper business and he was an elder at his church. But where did he have time to do, whether it's church or all of these nonprofits? It's just hard to really understand. But, but his life was one of service. So Charles Foster Kane and John Fairfax couldn't have been more different. When you think of John Fairfax, he had a legacy of service, a legacy of love to others, of many who loved him and admired him. He truly lived a legacy that you could be proud of, and a legacy that I, as his great-great-grandson, am proud of.
Let's end our little intermission, and let's get back to the final beats of Kane's story in Citizen Kane. We'll pick it up when Jedediah Leland, who is a drama critic for Kane's papers, moves from New York to Chicago after a falling out with his lifelong friend, after he calls him out on his declaration of principles, which he's not been living up to. Leland begins to write a savage review of Susan Alexander's performance, but passes out drunk in the middle of it. Kane arrives, sees the unfinished review, and completes it. Now, surprisingly, he doesn't do what you think he'd do, change it, make it sound like it's glowing. He actually attacks it just the way Leland had done it. He attacks his wife, Leland says later, quote, "to prove to me he was an honest man." He wanted so much to have his buddy affirm him, and that wasn't going to happen. It gets worse from there, folks. Susan tries to kill herself. Then she leaves Kane. It's while raging at her after leaving him that he discovers a snow globe on an end table. He begins to cry and says "Rosebud" while looking at it. He pockets it and stops his destruction. He dies not long after that. Some of his grand collection of possessions are sold off, but many are simply discarded. The last scene shows the sled, the one he was playing on happily when he was sent away by his parents, and it's burning up in the fire. And slowly, the brand name of that sled comes clear. It's revealed to be Rosebud. So the audience learns finally what Kane's last words mean. Rosebud represents a life he wishes he could have lived versus the life he did live. What would you say, Warwick, are the chief lessons of Citizen Kane as they pertain to bouncing back from a crucible that all of us can take off of the movie screen, off of our television sets, and apply to our own lives when it comes to bouncing back from a crucible?
That last scene of the movie that you describe, or last scenes where he says Rosebud, that snow globe drops on the floor, and we see some folks throw that sled that he had as a boy into the fiery furnace. It's so sad because in one sense, I think as he's dying, he realizes life could have been different. He had, maybe it wasn't an idyllic life, but maybe it seemed more idyllic than his subsequent life. He could have been in Colorado in a more of a normal life. As you mentioned, he said, if I hadn't had all this wealth, I could have been a great man. You know, he obviously had some innate ability and drive. Who knows who Charles Foster Kane would have been? So I think there was a sense in his dying moments of wistfulness of what might have been if I hadn't been abandoned by my parents, abandoned by my mother, hadn't suffered the crucible of immense wealth. What might have been Rosebud? I think it was symbolic of a road not taken and a life not lived. So his worst day did indeed define him. His crucibles defined him. His life choices defined him. Yes, he suffered through crucibles of abandonment and money and wealth that he didn't cause, but then he ended up causing more crucibles, hurting his first wife, Emily, his second wife, Susan. He ends up destroying his political career in his campaign for governor. He alienates his best friend, Jedediah Leland. He suffered crucibles, but he caused many others that hurt himself and hurt others. So really, this is a sad tale. We often say that joy, happiness, and fulfillment can only come from a life on purpose serving others, what we call a life of significance. Serving yourself in some ego-driven way doesn't lead to happiness. And Citizen Kane is really a tale of a road that you do not want to travel. What's the point of having all this wealth and power, living in this massive palace of Xanadu, all alone in this cold, empty, gilded prison? That's not a life that anybody should want to live. A life where you've alienated everybody. You, rather than loving other people, you just cause them pain. You can't buy love. You can't buy happiness. It doesn't work that way. You want people to love you. You've got to love them in a selfless, self-sacrificial way. You got to think of others more highly of yourself. So really, Citizen Kane is a cautionary tale about somebody that we don't want to be. And it's easy to say, oh, that couldn't be me. Well, when crucibles happen, if you choose not to forgive, and if you choose to be consumed by anger and bitterness, then that could be you. And once you go down the road of anger and bitterness, it's almost inevitable that you will cause more crucibles on yourself and more crucibles on others.
And as we do when we have mostly dialogues between the two of us, Warwick, I want to leave folks with a reflection question, something hopefully this conversation has given you a lot to think about your own crucibles, about how people move through crucibles, beyond crucibles. So here's a reflection question for you to take with you as we leave you. And it's just one, so it's not a lot of homework, but spend some time thinking about this, jotting down your answers. Here's the question. What are the dangers of letting a crucible fester and defining your life that Citizen Kane shines a spotlight on? And with that, I will say, cut. We have finished episode 1 of our series, Classic Films, Classic Crucible Lessons. Folks, come back next week. We'll save some seats for you when we go through our next film. See you then. Welcome to a journey of transformation with the Beyond the Crucible assessment. Unlike any other, this tool is designed to guide you from adversity to achievement. As you answer a few insightful questions, you won't just find a label like the helper or the individualist. Instead, you'll uncover your unique position in the journey of resilience. This assessment reveals where you stand today, the direction you should aim for, and crucially, the steps to get there. It's more than an assessment. It's a roadmap to a life of significance. Ready? Visit beyondthecrucible.com. Take the free assessment and start charting your course to a life of significance today.